You've heard about Homebrew, and you've heard about raw rules as written, and you've heard about pre-generated material, and you've heard about the rule of cool. But what exactly is the difference between Homebrew and pre-generated stuff, and why would you want to use the one or the other or both? Oh, I don't know. This is why and how and what you should be doing with regards to Homebrew versus pre-generated. Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Guy and we're talking about the difference between Homebrew and pre-generated. Now, there are dozens of pre-generated settings, campaigns, adventures that you can get out there. I write them myself, so I should know. There are a lot of options for you when you go pre-generated. Now, a lot of people go pre-gen. But a lot of people, and especially, and I have to say this, it seems to be the older folk, the old ones, such as myself, for example, I absolutely hate pre-generated stuff, even though I write it. How does that work? Well, the thing is the reason why I hate pre-generated material is because I love homebrewing material so much, to the point that when I'm given pre-generated material, I should say, generally speaking, I try to rewrite it into my own space. Now, why do I do that? Well, I'm going to answer that a little bit later on in the video, but for now, let's look at the difference. The primary difference. Homebrew material is material that you have created yourself. So the environment in which the players are going to find their characters in, that you have created. You created the world. You've made your own world map. You've populated it with monsters. Maybe those are pre-generated monsters from a monster's manual or handbook, or perhaps you've created your own monsters. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. Now, every game that I have run almost in my entire career is homebrew. Pre-generated is where you're taking a setting book which has all of this information already created for you, and it's laid out in the book, and if you want to go to that part on the map, you simply open up to the corresponding chapter and it's all there. All the information is there. So the biggest difference is, one, you're creating stuff from scratch. The other is that you have a world worth of knowledge in a book that you are now going to have to use and absorb into your game. So why would we not just use pre-generated? Surely it's faster, surely it's easier, surely it's all been done by somebody who's spent a long time, hopefully, creating an amazing world for you to play in. Well, there is a huge amount of difference between making your own stuff and using somebody else's material. So the biggest difference for me between homebrew and pre-generated is that homebrew is an incredibly daunting first step. It's like, I've got to create everything. Where do I even start? Whereas with pre-generated material, you now have to take everything that's been created and add it into your little frame here. You've got to add it into your brain because you need to be able to access that information without having to stop when the players ask you a question and page through a giant setting book or an adventure book. So the big difference is that for me. So then how do you handle it? I mean, how do you handle homebrew? Well, you need to know where to get started. And there are lots of different approaches on how to get started. I, generally speaking, always start with a map. I create a map of the area that I want to explore or create. Now, this is based off of an idea. So I go, oh, I've got this really cool idea for an adventure where the players are all going to be on a science fiction outpost. It's an asteroid, and the final sequence is the asteroid explodes and they all got to escape from the asteroid. That's your idea. So then I would make a map of that asteroid and all of the different races that live on it in the starbase, that sort of thing. I'd make those maps first, and then I start to work out what goes on from there in terms of creating the political organizations, the NPCs, the equipment, the various aliens, the monsters that are going to be lurking around on that asteroid. All those things then start to flow from that map. There are other methods, but that's not the purview of today's video. With pre-generated, however, it's all about reading through the entire thing. Yes, the entire thing. So if you're going for a setting, if you're going for a world setting, you've got a lot of reading ahead of you. It's about reading through that and understanding the tone. Hopefully, if it's well-written pre-generated material, it will have a tone, it will have a feeling. This is a dark, honorable game, or something like Curse of Strahd, where there's lots of darkness and death and moroseness going on, but there is honor to be found in this space. On the other hand, if it's something completely different where everyone is happy and bubbly and it's Care Bears and there's rainbows everywhere, you need to understand that, because once you have understood that, you can then start to absorb the information better. Either way, with Homebrew, you're developing new stuff. With pre-generated, you are absorbing that stuff, and you have to understand that. You can't just jump straight in and start going with pre-generated stuff. And there's a reason for that. In Homebrew, your players are not going to know what to expect. You've created this world from scratch. They have no idea what's going on in that space. Whereas in a pre-generated space, they may already have read the book before you, or they may be reading the book with you, or they may have already played in this space before. This is the primary reason why I avoid pre-generated material unless I am absolutely and totally familiar with the setting. So I will do pre-generated Star Wars. That's a pre-generated system. We know what's going on in the Star Wars universe. We know who the bad guys are. We know who the good guys are. So that is a space that is pre-generated, and like it or not, that's one of the ones that I use. Star Trek is another great example. I know both of those worlds intimately, and I am happy to play in them. However, if you said to me, okay, we're going to play in the land that the Legend of Zelda game is set in. I'm assuming it's set in a land. I don't know. I've never played it. And we're going to have Princess Zelda. I have no idea. I'm probably insulting so many people right now. My partner is probably rolling around. Yes, lots of eye rolling going on. I can sense it from here. Whatever the situation might be, if you're taking an existing pre-generated space, you need to understand how that works. Whereas if it's a homebrew space, you are making that stuff up on the fly. What this translates into in terms of a big difference with homebrew and with pre-generated from a player perspective is they have no idea in a homebrew world what to expect. This is often why when we are playing science fiction games or fantasy games set in your own world, your players are often at a loss. They have no reference points. So what this means is when you are creating a homebrew setting, you also need to create a homebrew primer for your players. So you can say, right, this is the world map. This is what your characters would know. These are some of the legends. These are some of the myths. Again, as I said, homebrew can be incredibly daunting if you are someone who likes to prepare everything. Now, I don't do a huge amount of prep, but I do a large amount of pre-game stuff for my characters, for my players. Primers, these are the races, this is the basic politics of the world, this is the world map, this is where you're from, this is what you would know. And that sort of thing. So that is something that I do. Then furthermore to that, I then throughout the entire game will be saying to my player characters, oh yes, make a history roll. You know from your past when you were living in the village that this was the scenario. So I try and put in more history into the player characters as they go throughout the game by allowing them to make rolls and checks rather than expecting them to just know what's going on. In a pre-generated situation, of course, it's easy enough. You hand over the primer that was written with the pre-gen to the players, and you get them to read it. The problem is that then you suspect or you assume that the players have obviously read this primer and know what's going on. But they're not as invested in your world as you are. You're running the whole world. They're just running their characters. So there is also the opportunity for them to not know what's going on, in which case then you, as the font of all knowledge of this pre-generated space, have to then give them that information and hopefully not stop and have to read up that information. That's the big critical thing for me. And I think as a lazy GM, I don't like having to stop and reference stuff. So with a homebrew, if I walk into a territory that I haven't planned yet, and my characters ask me questions, I can make them up on the fly without having to resort to a book. And also, I know that whatever I'm making up is not then going to be questioned by players when they go, well, excuse me, actually, his name is not Darth Vader, his name is Darth Vader. It's pronounced with a V. And you're going, I knew that. Seriously, I did know that. All right, so that is where the big differences lie. Subtle differences, which I think people don't often anticipate, is that the biggest trick is you are going around in Homebrew, you are creating all of this stuff on the fly, you've got some stuff developed, you haven't got all of the stuff developed. Your players might lose where they are in terms of the information, or you might be giving out information and not keeping track of the information that you're giving out. And so some ancient legend that you happen to pass off in the middle of a session where your player is having a dream sequence, you talk about some mountain range or other that doesn't exist, or you talk about NPCs that you intend to include in your game later on, but you forget to take notes, and of course then it vaporizes. You have no reference material to then go back to when you are then going to run your game. With a pre-generated, of course, that doesn't happen, because obviously you're only introducing elements that exist within the pre-generated setting. So there's a very, very big up, if you like, in terms of why pre-generated is very, very popular, in my opinion, because it is already recorded for you. You don't have to do all of that grunt work. Now, of course, pre-generated goes wrong when you run out of pre-generated material. There might be a forest on the map, which the pre-generated folks who were writing the settings book or the adventure didn't bother to include, because they thought there's no ways the PCs are going to end up walking there, and we don't need to waste paper or space or printing cost to include that forest descriptor. They walk into the forest, and now you have nothing. Literally, it's just a forest. So in panic, all you do is just tell them that it's a boring old forest, it's got nothing to do with anything, and hope that they go back to where the pre-generated path takes them. That's a bit of a problem, isn't it? So I believe, before we get to the last few steps of this video, hopefully, he said, I believe that a certain mix is actually required. But more on that at the very end of the video. Okay, so when we then look at the advantages, what are the advantages of Homebrew? Well, I have kind of mentioned them already throughout the video. The main advantage for me is that you are just making stuff up as you go along. If you haven't written it yet, if you haven't created it yet, it's not a problem. All you do is you just make it up. Make notes on how to do that, of course, and what you have done, so that you can then add that to your world setting, but then just move on. It's as simple as that. So that's one of the main advantages. There's a huge amount of flexibility as a GM. You're not constrained by what has been written before. On the other hand, with pre-generated stuff, you can quite easily focus on all of the other aspects of the game. You are not worried about the name of the mayor of this town. It's created for you. You're not worried about random adventures within that village, because there's a table that has random adventure encounters already generated for that area within the campaign setting. They're wandering through a dungeon. You have no fear of what is behind that door. It's already created for you. The stat blocks of the monsters are already there. So your prep time from that perspective is greatly reduced. Those are two very big and very opposite, I think anyway, spaces in terms of your headspace. So pre-generated is great for going, I haven't prepped anything. I don't want to go anywhere. I'm going to use this pre-generated adventure. Not a pre-generated setting, because that would be an entire campaign type of thing. But that is definitely one of the major advantages of pre-generated stuff. Now, when we then get to the negatives, what are the negatives? Well, the negative of the Homebrew is that you have to do all of the work. If you don't like creating worlds, if you don't like going, who's the mayor of this little town? I don't care. I really don't care who the mayor is. What is the name of this town? It's Bobtown. It's called Bobtown. And the next town is called Bib, and the next one is called Beb, because I watched a video once on how to create names, and that's it. There is a huge amount of work that needs to be done in a Homebrew game. Now, when I look at my own Homebrew games, I will quite honestly say that they have taken decades to develop. And once you've developed it, it's like, oh, this has taken me a really long time to set it up. Okay, next. Because you will move on. You'll create a new Homebrew world, and you'll create a new this, and you'll create a new that. It happens, trust me. So there's a huge amount of work that you have to do in terms of a Homebrew world rather than a pre-generated one or a Homebrew adventure. You have to create all of that stuff and hopefully watch all the videos on this YouTube channel in order to know how to make them that much more interesting and engaging. pre-generated, of course, it's all already done and hopefully is already an engaging and exciting adventure. That's why you bought it in the first place. The negative, of course, with a pre-generated is that you have to remember it all. Now, I will never forget, I was running, it was Pathfinder Society's game, which are pre-generated adventures. And I had players sitting around my table. Some of them had not played in Pathfinder Societies, and others had. Now, Pathfinder Society was basically a global collective where you played through adventures, and provided that the GM was an authorized GM, you could then go and log your character details on their website, and then you could play with that character in any Pathfinder Society game anywhere in the world. And it would all be, you know, legal and all that kind of nonsense. So I ran the adventure and, you know, it was a convention, so I was having fun, I was improvising, I was adapting, I was changing, and at the end of the adventure, two of the players came to me and said, well, you know, that's actually broken the system, because in this particular adventure, we're supposed to find the sword of X, Y, and Z, and I was supposed to get this armor from the guild or whatever that was included in the adventure, which you didn't even mention. So can you just say that we got those things? What? That's not how it works. That's not what it's supposed to be about, in my opinion. I was completely wrong, of course. They valued Pathfinder Societies, and so I should have respected that. I didn't, unfortunately. But that is the big penalty of a pre-generated game, is that players who know the system, players who know the environment, they're going to be metagaming. They might try and avoid it, but there is a certain amount of metagame that comes into it. And it's not a lot of fun, especially if you're like, okay, well, Dumbledore is now the wizard. He's the lead wizard of Hogwarts, and everyone goes, it's not Dumbledore, it's Dumbledore. Oh, all right, okay. Well, Hodor walks down the corridor. Who the hell is Hodor? You know, Hodor, didn't he hold the door? Wrong genre. Oh my God. That's a big penalty of pre-generated, and often it's a reason why I don't like playing in them, is because people will then say, well, that's not true, that's not what's in that village. It is what's in my village. All right, so obviously you get where I'm going with this. So there's pros, there's cons, there's positives, there's negatives on both sides as far as I'm concerned. When it comes to playing games, I am a homebrew person myself. Even if I'm doing something like Star Trek or Star Wars, I like to say, okay, well, we're playing in that setting, and there's stormtroopers, and there's Emperor Palpatine, or there's the Klingons and the Romulans. I don't mess around with those basics. I make sure that I'm in a little space that hasn't necessarily been covered in the videos, in the films, in the movies, and all that sort of thing, so that my players can't quote me and say, but actually in the Briar Patch this is the case, and there are pockets of this gas or that gas, and I should be able to cause them to explode. I try and avoid that. So I play homebrew predominantly. I don't mind the workload. And one of my big philosophies with homebrew is I created the map. If you want to go to that particular area in the map, let's go together. We'll go and explore that. As you're wandering down those streets, so am I, busy describing to you what my imagination is throwing up as fast as it possibly can. Later on, I try and commit it to memory, and I try and commit it to my notes. Or I will be for this year, as the 2021 challenge was for me to make better notes. Those are my thoughts on homebrew versus pre-generated. I know it's sometimes a contentious issue, so what are your thoughts? What do you think when we're talking about homebrew or pre-gen? Let us know in the comments down below. I think it's going to be an interesting one to discuss, because ultimately there is no wrong or right answer. There's just whatever works for you. So what works for you, and why does it work for you? Now, if you have enjoyed this video, I would implore you to hit that like button. There's the like button down there, or the subscribe button if you want to get alerted when more of these videos come out. They come out weekly, so it's pretty predictable. This week's video was sponsored by Dungeon Fog. Now, Dungeon Fog has been on this channel forever. They really have been, and there's a very good reason. I absolutely adore them. I use them for everything. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If I'm not using Dungeon Fog at least twice a week, I'm not running games. And even when I'm not running games, I'm usually creating maps anyway. I absolutely adore Dungeon Fog. And recently they've gone from an upgrade from version 3 to version 5. Yes, they're using the, I believe the Windows/Apple/Samsung naming convention, going from 3 to 5. But in version 5, there has been a absolute explosion of options, and it has really improved it so much. And I know that there's more coming out, which I'm super excited for. You will, of course, hear about it on the channel. Nonetheless, Dungeon Fog are our partners, our allies, and our friends, and they brought you this video in conjunction, of course, with our wonderful Patreons. Until next week, I wish you and yours the very happiest of gaming.